All right, good afternoon, everyone. I start by acknowledging that UBC's Vancouver campus is located on the traditional territory of the Amaskan people and recognize that you may come from lands whose ancestral caretakers deserve our respect and admiration. We're delighted to welcome Dr. Patrick Culbert to conduct a talk titled, "What if you used exams to teach?" "What did you get for number 3?" said the student in the hallway post-exam. An animated discussion follows, punctuated by sounds of triumph and disappointment. This is a part of the learning process, and the student who realized their mistake will likely never make that mistake again. What if we could harness that post-exam energy for learning? Two-stage exams are just that. The idea may be odd, but it is supported by research and student feedback, which Patrick will share with us today. Interesting, he just came from a midterm earlier this morning.
Not a two-stage.
Was it a two-stage? No. Now, not all exams need to be two-stage. Will I make fun of that in this introduction? Yes, I would. So it's interesting. This is a topic that I am particularly interested in. So often we have to remind students who perform badly on an exam for whatever reason that exams are sometimes as tough as life. They test you first and then teach you the lesson. Patrick is a landscape ecologist by training with a bachelor's degree in forestry and computer science and a PhD in forestry from the University of Wisconsin, where he was born and raised. He completed a research postdoc at Humboldt University in Berlin, followed by a teaching postdoc at Middlebury College in Vermont. He joined our UBC Faculty of Forestry in 2016, where he is now a highly esteemed associate professor of teaching and director of curriculum. He is known to students and the public through his very famous YouTube channel, where he teaches about forests and forestry in British Columbia. I use it a lot, actually. In the classroom, he employs innovative evidence-based teaching practices to better help students learn and retain their newly acquired knowledge. Before we proceed, a couple of logistics. This event now is fully in person, so these events have been switched. We are ditching the hybrid part. We are still recording it, so that we can generate our YouTube video for a channel. But that means if you don't want to be in the video, you may show up, let me know, we'll blur your face, we'll do something, but just let me know at the end. And there's also a sign-in sheet, an attendance sheet that we appreciate if you sign, because we need to reconcile the sandwich consumption in workday. I'm not kidding. Thanks so much, as always, to the Dean's Office and all colleagues who make this event possible, Michelle's team in particular, Karen, who puts it together, and to the wonderful public without which these events would not be possible. So a round of applause for everyone, and the floor is all yours.
Okay. All right, thank you, everybody. I appreciate so many people joining today, and it's kind of fun to. It's kind of nice to not be wondering if I'm missing questions in the comments. So I appreciate everybody making it in person. I haven't given this talk before, so I'm not entirely sure on timing, but I'm going to try to save a bit of time at the end for some discussion, because I think this is the kind of thing where it might be helpful for people to kind of think about, like, is this something that might be useful in your course, and what are the things that might make it work well or might be more challenging? So I'm really happy to have a little bit of conversation about those things at the end. Andres kind of read the blurb for this, which kind of covered this. But I think you have all heard students in the hallway after the exam talking in an animated way about the exam, and you can hear those noises that reveal who got the right answer and who did not. I'm sure you can all think back to an exam question in your life that you got wrong, and you remember the correct answer now very clearly, or maybe the spelling bee word that you went out on in grade 5, something along those lines. So the idea is that it's kind of a funny moment after students take an exam. They're really engaged, they're really animated. They're kind of often emotionally involved too. And that's really a recipe for learning. So the idea behind two-stage exams is trying to harvest that energy. And I will say the very first time that I just kind of tangentially heard about these, I thought, like, group exams, that sounds kind of dumb. That was kind of my initial brush off. But a couple of years ago at a CTLT event, I had somebody kind of explain it in detail, and I thought, oh, that's actually pretty intriguing. And I gave it a shot the next term, and in one of my big courses, I've been using it ever since and been very happy with that approach. So the basics of a two-stage exam The first stage, the individual stage, is just your normal exam. It's just a little bit shorter. That's the only difference. So you hand out your exam, students take that exam individually, and then they hand it back in, whether that's physically or electronically. Then they get in small groups and they do either the full exam or some subset of questions again as a team. So now they're doing the exam collaboratively, and then they hand that in. So why go to the trouble on this? Oh, I realize that's going to be covering my headers. That's all right. So why go to the trouble? It's definitely some logistical hoops to jump through. So why bother? There is actually pretty good evidence of improved exam performance and improved learning on this. And it's kind of a perfect storm for learning. I already mentioned that a little bit, but students are usually well prepared for the exam. Kind of those mornings of the exam or those hours before the exam are probably when a lot of the material is freshest in their mind, especially if they've been cramming, which isn't great, but that's another story. So students, they've been studying, it's fresh in their mind, they're making connections with the material. And during that individual stage, they've thought long and hard about all of those questions, right? And they're also highly motivated by the exam grade. We often, even if you have exams, grade is a little bit weighted, not so high, it's still a pretty big component. So there's extrinsic motivation involved there as well. So we can kind of harness that. We can take advantage of those scenarios. So there is some support from this in cognitive science. Is anybody familiar with Eric Mazur? He's a physics professor at Harvard, I think. He's been involved in, there's folks that do disciplinary-based education research. So he's done a lot of research on physics education, especially working very hard to kind of improve that classic physics 100 course where half of the students fail. I think he was one of the folks that said, half the students are failing intro physics. Maybe it's on us. And he's worked very hard. One thing that he does a lot of is peer instruction, which is kind of a hardcore and very precise approach to think, pair, share. I won't go into all the details on that, but it's quite interesting what he does. But the idea is that students are doing some focused individual work, then committing to an answer. Then they have a collaborative discussion with a few of their classmates and maybe change their mind about that answer and then commit to that as a cohort. And that's a really effective model. There's really good evidence that this helps both with engagement and with learning. This also helps with this expert novice issue. How many of you can think back to taking an intro course, maybe calculus or physics or chemistry, and you knew the professor was brilliant, but you could not understand what they were talking about to save your life? And maybe if you were lucky, the 19-year-old sitting next to you could explain it to you better. They could explain it to you in a way that you could understand. There's a lot of really interesting reasons behind this that I'd be happy to chat about sometime. And part of it even just goes into working memory and how we store things in our memory. But sometimes a novice who has just figured something out may be much better positioned to explain that to another novice than you can as an expert. They know what each other's knows, where we know so much that we don't even know that we know. And somebody who, especially somebody who something just clicked for, they know what was that little piece of information that put it all together. And for us, we maybe had that little piece of information 20 years ago. So it's very hard for us to relate to the students. So I think this is a really powerful thing. And then there's been lots of research in cognitive science about effective learning strategies. Some of you might have seen it. I give a talk in a lot of intro courses about this. And there's two approaches here: elaborative interrogation and self-explanation. I won't go into the specific details of those, but they're both slightly different flavors of explaining a concept in your own words. So that is something that there's a lot of evidence behind that works well for learning. And when students are discussing a test question in a group, they are inherently engaged in this. And I'll make a note too, just as an aside, I heard a physics professor talking about this, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, but sometimes people are concerned that the top students are really carrying their team. But he was saying he overheard the really good student in the group kind of explaining the answer to the other students in the team. And then that student realized through his explanation that he had made a mistake. And so even though he wasn't necessarily gaining from his other teammates' understanding. By going through the exercise of trying to explain his answer, he learned something, he realized where he had went wrong. So as far as actual score and learning gains, team scores nearly universally exceed individual scores. That makes sense. If you've got 4 students take an exam individually, and then they collaborate and work on it together, they're almost, that team score is going to be better than most of those individual scores or all of those individual scores. So one question that comes up sometimes is this true synergy? Like, are the students actually helping each other learn? Are they actually figuring it out together? Or is it just the case that they know who the top performing student in the team is and they just kind of go with their answers? So, so one way to test that is to look at that team and say, hey, did the team's score exceed the top performing individual member of that team? And that doesn't always happen, but there's pretty good evidence that that happens pretty frequently. And then, as we all know, a score on an exam hopefully is a measure of your learning, but it's a very imperfect measure of learning. So people try to take this a step farther and say, hey, are students actually kind of understanding better and retaining information better beyond the exam? And this one's actually really tricky to test because when you do a 2-stage exam, you answer the same questions twice. And so there's something in cognitive science called the testing effect. Basically, if you get tested on something, you're going to remember it better in the future. So some people, including some folks here at UBC, have done studies where they have the students all take the same individual exam. And then for the 2-stage exam, some students get questions just about part A of the exam, and some students just get questions about part B of the exam. So they've all, I'm not probably messing up this explanation, but basically they've all, they account for that change of being tested twice in something. And in those studies, it's been a little bit mixed, these crossover studies. Some of them have found significant learning gains and some not. That said, doing these tests in real classroom environments, it's really, really hard to tease out effects just because of sample size issues and all of the other extraneous variables. So there's, at the very least, there's a hint that we definitely know that students individually will score better, teams will typically score better than individuals, and we've got a hint that the students actually are getting learning gains out of this versus just taking a traditional exam. So at UBC, these are pretty common in the Faculty of Science. I think it was probably about 10 years ago now, there was a grant from Carl Wyman to, there were a bunch of postdoctoral teaching fellows hired as part of this, and they did a lot of work with 2-stage exams. And so they're pretty common in like physics, biology, earth science, especially in the like kind of 100 and 200 level courses. So they've been using them pretty widely in science for about 10 years now. And the typical exam parameters, instead of having the exam, the individual portion lasts the full length of your class period. Usually people devote about 2/3 of that class period to the individual stage, roughly 1/3 to the team stage. And people vary these things, obviously, but this is kind of on average what people do. And then this part's pretty important too, the grade weighting. So people have looked at this and looked at what students think about this. And this seems to be kind of about the right split, something in this range, where if you make the team score real high, students can get nervous about that and think, hey, I want the exam to represent what I'm doing, not what these other students in the class are doing. So you don't want to make it too high, but you also want to make it high enough that there's some incentive for students to take that team stage seriously. So somewhere in kind of the 85-15 or maybe 80-20 range is a split that seems to work well and students seem to be fine with. And often people will also kind of add the caveat that the team stage cannot hurt the team score. So most student scores will go up in the team stage, but if you're a really strong student, maybe you got an 88 on the individual stage, and then maybe your team ended up getting an 87 on the team stage. The way most people do it is you won't be punished. You'll get an 88 for your whole score there. And then the team stage exam is usually identical to the individual stage. There are some reasons to change this up a little bit, and I've moved away from this, and as we go through, I'll explain a little bit why that was. And as far as the number of students in the team, teams of 3 to 4 are kind of the sweet spot. for this. If you have a team of two, that's kind of not enough opinions and different views to get that synergy. If you have a team of five, it can be kind of hard just to manage a discussion and come to an agreement on an answer. So I usually have teams of 4 in my courses, and then if a student drops, then it's a team of 3, or if somebody's sick on exam day, it's a team of 3. So I kind of aim for 4, and then know that some teams will end up being in groups of 3. Oh, and often in this, people talk about groups. I usually just use the word team. It's just a small kind of silly thing, but I think that a team kind of implies that you're working collaboratively toward a shared goal. So I always use the term team in my classroom. Okay, so that's kind of the gist of it. Now, some of you are probably thinking, some of you are probably thinking, this is great. Some of you are probably thinking, yeah, I don't know. So my question for you at this point is, what are your concerns about this? What do you think about this might not work, or what are your concerns about this? Somebody shoot. I know there's this that's totally fine. Yeah, that.
If they know that there will be another exam at the team, they may not work as hard, but then with the percentages you show, that would not be the case.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. It's kind of figuring out this balance to kind of maximize engagement and yeah.
The other thing I want is how are the groups assigned? Do you do that, or they are allowed?
Yeah, that's a really good question too, and I'll talk a little bit about what I do, but that's an important choice to make too. Are you just letting students assemble in their own teams? Are you assigning teams? Are these teams that are assembled day of the exam? Are these things that are much earlier in the term? So yeah, I think there's definitely some potential things that can go awry in team assignments. That's definitely what else?
I have a question about logistics.
Yeah.
Like in a room like this, it worked great, but if you're in a theater, how?
The first time I did 2-stage exams, I think I had 170 students in the course. So it's feasible. I will say, when I did it at that point, we were still using paper exams. And now we use Canvas, and that makes it a lot more straightforward. Yeah, so logistics is definitely something to think about. Yeah, Andres.
What about time? Because especially in these 50-minute slots, some of the exams, like we barely have time for them to sit down and do it. So
I'll touch on that a little bit. So I'm doing this in a 50-minute class. I think if you've got an 80-minute time slot, I think that's probably kind of optimum for one of these exams, but it can be done.
The other one would be, what type of exam do you, are these multiple choice, like how do you balance open-ended?
Yeah, and we'll talk about the variations. The course that I have mostly used this in is a second year course, and the exams are probably about a third like multiple choice or matching or sorting type questions, and then about 2/3 short answer questions, some of which may be a 2-sentence answer, or some of which might be kind of a paragraph type answer, or a question that has a couple subparts to it. Yeah, no, I think thinking about what type of questions you ask is really important. Other concerns? Yeah.
Do we actually incorporate case studies as well, or it doesn't work very? How does it work with case study based exams?
Oh, that's a good one. Yeah.
Because there's a lot of discussion that goes in, so I'm kind of thinking if we do it individually, what would it?
Let's revisit that one. I think it could work really well for case studies. Yeah, I think you could probably make it work. Okay. Any other concerns? Yeah.
You mentioned that for the individual part, you can about 2/3 of the time and 1/3 for the group work. But group work requires a lot of this. Is 1/3 enough, or have you sometimes do you think like it would be worth giving a bit more time?
Yeah.
For the stage?
That is a good question too, and I will dig into that one a little bit, but absolutely, like, time balance is important, and the challenge with a 50-minute exam, doing a 2-stage exam, is if you're 5 minutes too short or 5 minutes too long, that's a big deal if the individual portion is only half an hour long. Whereas if you've got an 80-minute time slot and your exam is 5 minutes too long or 5 minutes too short. So it is definitely a challenge. And your point about being able to engage in the team stage like that is an important one that I'll come back to. Okay, those are great. The first question the thing that I thought people were going to jump at, you were mostly coming at it from the instructor side. Usually people's first obvious thing is, oh, I bet good students hate this. And maybe some of you were thinking that, but didn't bring it up. Think, oh, I bet good students really hate this because they're just carrying the bad students or the slackers in their group. And so that I think that's definitely something that comes up sometimes. And then I guess the other question, I think this is probably more what a lot of you ask falls under is kind of, is it worth the hassle or chaos of this? Okay, so yeah, those are good questions. And then one question when I first started doing this was thinking a lot about equity. Thinking about kind of both challenges with the two-stage exam as well as how a two-stage exam might be helpful in this regard. So for example, and some of these questions are something that I addressed. I think it was it might have even been the first or second year that I used two-stage exams. I ran it as a study. It has been a long language paper that is unpublished, but I'm going to go over some of those results today. So kind of does student identity influence experience of two-stage exams? And there's a lot of literature in teaching about group work and how student identity can interact with group work favorably or unfavorably. And in many of our classes, we have a lot of students who are English language learners, who are not native English speakers. And in some regard, I thought this could potentially be really helpful for English language learners, because if you didn't quite understand something, especially on like a language comprehension level in the individual stage, when you get together with a couple other students, it's likely that that's going to help you out with that. Okay, so I thought in that regard, that might be helpful. But then I was also thinking, like with group dynamics, there may be a student who's an English language learner, especially if they're in a team with native English speakers, might feel less comfortable speaking up or engaging in that as well. And I was also thinking a bit about gender, because there's been a lot of research in physics education about mixed gender groups and how if it's a women majority team versus a male or man majority team, how that affects the discussion and like the amount of time that people of different genders speak and such. And the typical findings, and maybe things have changed now, because I think a lot of this is from 10 or 15 years old, was that basically in groups that are evenly split gender-wise or have more men than women, men take up a disproportionate amount of time talking, and the teams are more likely to go with ideas of men than women. So I was kind of thinking about how that might come into play with this as well. So a couple of years ago, I did a study, I'll like I would say in the journal, it was a large second year forestry course at a large public Canadian university. So we did in-class two-stage exams. It was a 50-minute class. We did 2 midterms and 1 final exam as two-stage exams. And this first time around, I let students kind of choose. I said, do you want to pick your own group? Or if you don't know people who you want to be in a group with, would you like me to pick a team for you? So that was how I did it this first time. About 80% of students opted to self-select their team, and then I randomly picked teams for students who did not. For the midterms, we did a 30-minute individual exam, and then this was at the paper stage. So then there was, unfortunately, kind of a frantic 5 minutes of trying to quickly gather those individual exams and hand out team exams. I'll say Canvas makes it more into about a 20-second transition, so that's a lot better. And then we did a 15-minute team exam, and I think I often would let that lead just a little bit into passing time, just to eke out a few more minutes if teams needed it. The final exam, things were a little bit more relaxed. We did a 90-minute individual stage, a 10-minute transition, basically a break for students, and then a 45-minute team stage. And then as people typically do, I weighted the student scores 85% individual and 15% team. And I did a ton of statistical analysis on this, and I'm just going to pull out a couple of things that were kind of interesting. I mean, we looked at students' individual performance, then we also looked at students' demographics, and we also surveyed students about their perceptions. So we had kind of lots of different variables in the works to look at. But at the real basic thing, okay, did we see synergy? So here are 2 midterms in the final. This was the mean exam scores, the mean exam scores of the top performing team member. So we're trying to kind of, so everybody, there were maybe one or two teams where the team score was lower than the individual, than the student's individual score. But I'm just working here with the score of the top performing team member to see if there was actual synergy. So for the two midterms, the team scores were pretty much exactly what the score of the top performing student was. So we didn't see synergy there. But what was funny is we did at the final. So on the final exam, the team scores on average were about 3% higher than the individual score of the top scoring student in that team. So that was relatively significant. So that was kind of interesting. So it wasn't significant for the midterms, but it was significant for the final. So aside from just random chance, it made me think about what was different about that final exam. And we'll come back to this a little bit later to see if we can tease that out. For English language learners, I kind of hypothesized that they would be likely to have a larger score gain. And on average, that was definitely the case. It was so significant for one midterm, not for the others. So maybe a little bit of evidence that ELL students were getting a bigger bump in that team stage than non-ELL students. And this is a little bit intuitive because also the ELL students tended to be lower performing students in the class overall. So they also just had kind of more room to go up. Evidence of a larger score gain for ELL students, English language learners. The preferences was kind of interesting. So I did a bunch of questions on a Likert scale. So 5 in this case was strongly agree. I asked students, okay, do you prefer a 2-stage midterm and do you prefer a 2-stage final in comparison to a traditional individual only exam? And this is interpolated median. So on the whole, most students had a favorable opinion of 2-stage exams and preferred them to a traditional exam. But what was interesting is ELL students were significantly more favorable compared to non-ELL students about using a 2-stage exam. So I thought that was kind of interesting. And let's walk through these briefly. I had some other questions in here too, but these are kind of the core ones. And these are, I mean, the emphasis here is on student perceptions. If you study kind of the science of learning or cognitive science, you know that we are actually really bad judges of our own learning. So we just have to kind of take this as students' perceptions, not whether they actually learn more. But students agree with most of these statements that explaining an answer to their group mates improved their understanding. Listening to their group mates' explanation improved their understanding. They appreciated being able to get a little bit of a score bump. They liked having immediate feedback and discussion with their teammates. So I didn't give them the right answers per se, but they might have joined in their team and it'd been very clear quickly, oh yes, we all got the same answer. That was right. Or, oh, you got that. Now I understand why that was wrong. So getting some immediate feedback there. Overall, the group portion improved their knowledge of course material. They felt comfortable expressing their ideas and opinions in the group. And then I asked them for a kind of whether they preferred 2-stage over traditional for midterms and for final. And this was kind of what was expected here. So I guess that's covered up. So the interpolated median was similar here. A little over 4, I think, for midterms, and a little bit lower for the final exam. And other people have found that too, where students are more likely to view a midterm as a little bit of a learning experience, but they view a final exam more as a cumulative test of their knowledge. And so some students feel a little bit more like that should really just be representative of their performance and not of their teams. But on the whole, students still preferred it. So on the whole, students really liked the 2-stage exams overall. There were a couple of students who said, this is horrible. I hate this. I want to just do the exam on my own. But that was maybe 2 or 3 students out of 100 some. So most students were like, this is really great. I really enjoyed doing this. And a slightly greater preference for 2-stage midterms than 2-stage finals. And I didn't show you the analysis on this. This one was kind of borderline significant. The higher performing students, their preference for 2-stage exams was a little bit lower than the lower performing students. So kind of that question of, oh, I bet the top students are really going to hate this. No, the top students liked this. The lower performing students liked it. It's just the lower performing students liked it a little bit more, which makes sense because they stood to gain a little bit more out of it grade wise. But even the high performing students, I think, appreciated that even if they didn't get a big score bump out of that, that there was potentially some learning gain there. And I also asked students just to kind of, is there anything else that you'd like to add about this? And we got 172 comments and categorized those. 27 of those were just generally positive comments, like I enjoyed two-stage exams. 21 commented on improved learning and understanding. I'll let you read this one. I thought this was a helpful one. This is kind of the goal. This is kind of the theory behind the two-stage exam. So it's nice that some students thought that was the case and perceived that to be what was happening. A couple of them commented about liking immediate feedback. I will also say a couple of them commented about disliking immediate feedback. Not many, but a few of them said, oh, it's really depressing to get in your team and realize you just got that question wrong, which is true. I can relate to that. At least in this case, they have a chance then to get a little bit of those points back. Whereas if you have that realization in the hallway as you're leaving the class, you don't have that opportunity. The critiques were really helpful. And this is actually going to get back a little bit into what Taya was saying earlier. So I got some insights from this that I did not get other ways, and it was extremely helpful for me. A lot of students said that the group stage was too rushed. And I knew it was rushed, but I didn't quite perceive how rushed it was because the students were all finishing the team stage. And again, with a 50-minute class and the first time trying these exams, that timing is really tight. And so I thought, okay, I'm doing okay on time because students are finishing the exams, but the students were saying, hey, we finished that team stage, but we really had to rush through it. And a number of students very helpfully suggested that the group stage should be a subset of questions for the exam, rather than every single question. A few students, especially mostly on the final, noted that the wait time is too long between the individual and team stages, and similarly that the final exam is too long. This is the challenge. In a very short exam, the students who finish first versus the students who finish last, there's not a huge spread. But if you've got an exam that's 90 minutes long, there's going to be some students who finish it in 45 minutes and some students who take all 90 minutes. And so the challenge is that the students who finished it in 45 minutes just had to sit there twiddling their thumbs for 45 minutes until the team stage. And being a final exam, they just kind of wanted to get the heck out of there. So I don't have a good solution for that, but that was a valid point. So I mentioned that part about how we had synergy on the final exam, but didn't find it on the midterm. And this is kind of what gave me some insight into this. The midterm exams were simply too rushed. And I hadn't specifically been asking students, hey, are you having enough time to finish that? Like, I knew it was rushed, but exams are rushed. And they were finishing, so I was thinking that was fine. But a couple of students in the comments, in those 3 response comments, said, hey, the team stage on the midterms, we didn't have time to actually talk about those questions in detail. We were just kind of quickly voting on them to go through them. But the final was less rushed. Students had more time to do that. Most students, I think there maybe were a few teams that stuck around through the full time of the final, but most finished up, so they had time to do that. So if the team stage is less rushed, then there's more time for meaningful discussion, and we get more of that synergy. We get, rather than just kind of assuming that your smart teammate has the right answer, you actually discuss that question. So you might realize, like, oh, they actually didn't get it this time. Somebody else had a more compelling argument for that answer. So this is really important. And this was kind of my biggest takeaway from this study. Oh, and I forgot to put a slide in here, but I will say that with kind of I was very interested with relation to gender and with ELL status, if students would feel kind of more comfortable or less comfortable speaking up, or more favorable about 2-stage exams or less favorable, whether they were in like an ELL majority group or an ELL minority group, or whether it was a woman in a woman majority group or a woman minority group. And I basically had no statistical power for any of those things because the ELL students almost all joined teams with other ELL students. And there were a number of mixed gender teams, but there were also a lot of all women teams that had self-organized in that as well. So I didn't see any differences with some of those questions that I was asking, simply because the students kind of already arranged themselves in that way. Okay, so how have I changed how I'm doing this since? I've greatly reduced the team stage, and also in my exams, I started having some more really meaty questions, kind of not necessarily short answer questions where the answer wouldn't necessarily be that long, but they were questions that you might have to kind of puzzle over. They're definitely not recall questions. And so I started just including those exams on the team stage. So it isn't as rushed, but the students are really focusing now on those 3 or 4 problems that were the really difficult ones from the individual stage. So it allows time for more discussion of those tricky questions. One funny side effect about this, which is fine, is that the team scores are now, like the scores on the team stage are now lower than they were before, which makes sense because if you have all the questions on the individual stage and then just the hard questions on the team stage, those team stage scores are going to be lower. So when I was doing the same exam for both, I would just have to go through and manually adjust a few students' scores because almost everybody would get a higher team score than an individual score. But now there's quite a few more that I need to adjust. So more students are getting a lower score on the team stage than on the individual stage, but that's fine. Like we can adjust for that. And they may actually still be improving. Like they may actually be getting more of the points on those difficult questions than they did on the individual score, but just the actual percent correct doesn't necessarily show that. This relates to how I teach my class on the whole now, and not just for the 2-stage exams. I now do fixed instructor selected teams with a focus on equity. I basically do a stratified random selection of teams so that no student is going to be the odd one out. So I try to have teams that are balanced by gender or female majority teams. I try to almost never have just one English language learner in a team, try to have it balanced 2 and 2. So I'm trying to have all of that balance in there. And then those are fixed teams for the term. There are some challenges with that, but I think most of the positives outweigh that. If you have a fixed team for the whole term, those students get really familiar with one another. And the way I teach most of my courses is we often have a brief in-class group exercise that the students do in their team, and they sit together. Like we have seating assigned by teams. So the students are very familiar with the 3 other members of their team and work very closely. I'm drawing a blank on the name of the researcher. Oh, he'll come to me. I saw a talk a few years ago from a researcher who does, we had a discipline-based education research in biology and specifically related to queer students. And one thing that she said that I thought was really, that I hadn't thought about that was really helpful. I knew that fixed teams tend to be helpful for students who feel introverted or have social anxiety because they just have to get to know a few people and then they get to know them well. But she was saying that this is also really important for queer students because every time you're in a group with new people, they need to decide if they're going to come out to those people or not. So I hadn't thought about that, but that was another reason why I thought, okay, that makes sense. Now I understand why it's really helpful for these students just to have this core cohort. I now do in-person Canvas exams that dramatically reduces the chaos of collecting individual exams and then handing them out. And so the individual portion is just the Canvas quiz. And then the team portion, I just post a Word document and one of the students will type the team's answers and then they submit it as a team assignment in Canvas. So that works pretty well. And people wonder about the grading on this. And the nice thing is that there's actually less grading because instead of having a 50-minute exam that everybody does, you have a 30-minute exam that everybody does, and then a 15-minute exam that you only get 1/4 as many. So the grading is actually just a little bit reduced than you would have with a traditional exam. Oh yeah, and these in-person Canvas exams, especially in a 50-minute class, being able to just say, okay, the team stage is now open, and then it takes them 30 seconds to open up that document in Canvas and start going. That gives them more time. It's much more efficient. And I will say, I have never seen a classroom more engaged and energized with what they were doing than like in those first 2 minutes of the team stage. It goes from a completely silent classroom to an extremely loud classroom with very energetic students having, maybe not heated discussion, but very animated discussions. And I sometimes ask some conceptual questions that involve things like what happens to evapotranspiration if the Earth's axis tilt was to go from 23 degrees to 5 degrees. So I ask silly questions like that. And so I can see the students up in the lecture halls going, they're all gesturing, and I can see them trying to use their hands to explain to each other. It's beautiful. All right. So kind of my suggested practices, if you're thinking about doing this, this works very well with multiple choice, short answer, or problem set types of exams. Essay exams, I think, can be more challenging just because it's easier to, even if you're talking about something that's very conceptually difficult, if you can get that answer down in 3 or 4 sentences, that's pretty quick. Whereas trying to collaboratively write something is a bit more challenging. So I think it probably can be done on essay exams, but I think you have to be pretty deliberate in thinking about how you do that. I think it's important to heavily weight students' individual exam scores and make the team stage such that it can only improve their score. That 85-15 seems to be fine. And students appreciate that their score can't go down. And then those two things together make the students pretty happy with that. Explain to students why we're doing this. I often am very explicit. I teach my courses in kind of a weird, elaborate way. And I always take time to very explicitly tell students why I'm doing this thing this way and what's the evidence behind it, so that they know that it's not just because I teach weird, it's because I'm, or not just because I like to make things complicated. It's because I'm doing these things because I believe that it's going to improve their learning. This is another really important one too, is to explain good collaborative strategies to students. So the worst strategy for a team stage is to just vote on what the answer is. Because often there are going to be exam questions where the majority of people are going to get that wrong. But if you discuss it, the one person who had the right answer may be able to very quickly convince their neighbors. It might be kind of one of those, oh, I didn't think of that kind of thing. So the best approach for students to use is to discuss why they think a given answer is correct or incorrect. And that goes back to why I think we had synergy on the final exam, but not the midterms. On the midterms, students did this approach by necessity. On the final exam, they had enough time to do that approach. And then big thanks to Nolan Bett, Dylan Mendenhall, and Laura Super, who helped me facilitate this study a couple of years ago when we did it and dig through the data. And my collective apologies to them that I have not managed to finish the manuscript yet, but something. Okay. All right. I think we probably hopefully answered most of the questions that folks had, but I'm really curious, especially if you're kind of just trying to puzzle through in your mind, if you might want to do this in your class or how you might do it in class. If you've got questions, I'm very happy to answer. Yeah, Greg.
So thanks for laying it all out. You've done this yourself, you've done it repeatedly. So I'm just going to challenge it just for giggles, not because I necessarily don't believe this could work. You did this. If you had to describe it as succinctly as possible, what were the positive impacts? Like how much more learning did your students do because you did this relative to the counterfactual of you not having done this at all?
Yeah.
And also, is it even possible that there are negative impacts to this that you're not telling us about?
On the learning gain, I will honestly say I don't know on the learning gain because that's really, really hard to measure. I will say, I mean, just that synergy effect, just showing that a team score that like the team will do better than the best team member did on that subset of problems. Like that's pretty good evidence to see that it's worth the time. And just kind of my anecdotal evidence of the level of engagement that I see in that team stage and see those discussions and the feedback that I get from students saying, oh, this is really cool. I appreciate you doing this approach. And then, or rephrase your last question in the negative part.
Well, is there any bad side.
Okay, yeah.
It's because there wasn't even really any allusion to the possibility of badness in your talk.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, is it because it just doesn't exist and it obviously doesn't need to be addressed, or is
Notice, I do think that was hiding from you. One is there's definitely gonna be a few students who just, I mean, in a class of hundreds of some students, there's gonna be a few students who hate it.
Yeah.
And just say, please let me just do the exam individually. I do not want to do this. It's a small number, but it's there. And then there's a lot of benefits to fixed teams, but in a big class, you're gonna get a few teams that are just duds. And in one of my last terms in this class, I had one team, and it's always a team that starts out as 4 and then somebody drops, so then you got 3. And then it turns out that one of those students is somebody who always comes to class, and 2 of the students only show up for the exam.
Yeah.
And so that's hard to deal with because it's unfair to that one student, but it's also very challenging to just, to like, you also don't want to break up teams that are working to rearrange them to give them each a teammate. So I don't have good solutions to this, but like that is, to me, probably the biggest shortfall. And in that case, that student, since her teammates also didn't show up to lab, typically she was typically just working in lab with another group, and so I said, yeah, for the team stage, you work with that team, and that's fine. So that's the biggest downfall, is just the classic issue of fixed groups where some of them just don't work. Yeah.
You know how for the second time round, you have the team stage just go through the meeting question. But you still account that exam as a whole, it's like 2 exams.
Yeah.
Would it be interesting to explore just replacing the new grade of those meeting questions in the previous exam, so that,
To compare that?
yeah, to
Yeah.
compare, not the exam, because this is a whole exam.
Yeah,
and it's a
yeah.
staff set.
Oh, okay.
So just the staff set against the staff set.
Okay.
And
Are
I'd like
you
to be
are you talking about just for my interest or for the student's score bump itself?
both,
Okay,
because
yeah.
you were saying that sometimes that exam was lower than the individual grade, and that because you picked on the.
Yeah.
What if you just would replace the one that you?
Yeah, no, that's true. That's certainly a possibility. It's easier just to like get the spreadsheet out and see like, oh, they got scored less. This is what I need to give them to do that. But that certainly would be a way to do that. And I haven't dug into it, trying to figure out kind of the score game, just from a perspective of how it's looking. One thing that I didn't mention that I'll just say real quickly is another option that sometimes people do is to have a totally different question in the team stage as well. Especially if you can have like a meaty kind of synergistic question that like pulls together several things from the individual stage of the exam. I think something that would be helpful too. I do think it's really powerful though, if you give a student a challenging question and they try it on their own and they succeed or fail, but then they get together with their teammates and then they succeed together. So I think there is good value in using some of those individual ones, but I think there may also be cases too where you can come up with a question that ties a bunch of the stuff together that wasn't on the individual exam. That would be great for students through the team. Yeah.
You consider, especially for the midterm, where there's this time constraint to decouple those and have maybe, I know it will be a problem with time.
On a different
but
day?
On a different day, or maybe even as homework.
Yeah,
Some sort
I
of-
thought about that, and I think that, if you couldn't hear the back, others were saying perhaps having the team stage on a different day. I thought about it. I think it's really important for it to happen immediately. So the main thing that I do is I currently in that class, I have 3 inaccurately named midterms and then 1 final exam. And so that's kind of the route that I've gone, is to have more exams so that each exam is covering less material, so then we can have these. And I make the first exam is just worth 10% of their grade because it's a little chaotic and they don't quite know my exam style yet. And then the subsequent exams and the midterm are all worth 15% a piece, to try to, again, also just kind of have a lower stakes, like these exams are important and they're going to affect your grade, but it's not a 40% on exam. Yeah.
How important do you think the stakes to the outcomes you see? Because obviously the stakes are to get a mark on the exam, but you could also have it as an exercise in class about grades. You think it will be very different in how they engage with it.
I do. I think the exam grade is important because just about everybody will show up to an exam and they will have studied, whether that's studying diligently over the past 3 weeks or cramming for 3 hours the night before. Whereas just about anything else in a class, even if you have diligent students, some of them are going to arrive unprepared for class. So I think the preparation part is important. Like that motivation is important for the preparation, and also like just the level of engagement. Like I do lots of in-class small group exercises where they discuss a question and put together their team thoughts and hand it in, and they're engaged and I can hear them discussing. But when it's the exam, it's like that turned up to 11. So I think the level of engagement and motivation is really due to that exam atmosphere. Yeah. But again, like that first midterm is only worth 10% of the grade. So that's not it's not massive. It's not make or break, but it's enough to get them really motivated. Yeah. Yeah.
So bad experimental design, but thinking back to trying to understand whether there's any learning effect, is there any value in looking at not the top performing students, but the mid or lower performing students, the differences in how well they did the individual portion for the second and third midterms versus the fourth midterm, and in particular compared to the prior year, if you give very similar examples?
Yeah.
So whether or not they've improved over the term compared to when they don't have the two things.
That's a good question. My gut would be that there might be some signal there,
Yeah.
but I would imagine it would be completely buried
Yeah.
in all of the other noise. That in classroom research is so hard to do and get control for all the extraneous variables. But that is interesting. And I do cumulative exams. All my exams are cumulative as well. And so that theoretically would help those students too, because if they were getting some learning gain from that team stage of exam 1, hopefully that will come back in the final or maybe in exam 3. Yeah, it's a good thought. Yeah,
I've got a question.
Go for it.
So this is actually broader than this one particular thing is, I think it's amazing to have various innovations in pedagogy and assessment and whatnot. But when we try those things, we may not get it right the first time around. So how do you mitigate risk to the students about messing it up when we try to do this for the first time?
Yeah, I will say with this, it was very nice that other people at UBC had done this.
Right.
When I asked that first time, have any of you done this exam before? There were only about 3 who had, but as part of that, Carl Wyman, the fellowship, they had put out like lots of nice documentation and stuff. And I think, kind of at the very least, the guarantee that students' team stage isn't going to hurt them.
Right.
was helpful, but it was definitely chaotic that first time around, and especially that first round, it really depended on having TAs to help run around and hand out papers. It's a little bit better with Canvas, but it's definitely there's definitely more room for error. I think it's also helpful to let students know if something is new, and try to get a little buy-in from them, and also kind of say like, I'm going to be really curious about your feedback on this, so that they kind of view themselves as partners in that to some extent. I think that can be helpful. I think sometimes, although as a white cishet guy, it's easier for me to say, this is new, I'm trying this out, and I think the students are more likely to give me the benefit of the doubt. So I have to recognize that. Yeah. I appreciate all your questions. Those are good thoughts.
Thank you so much.